Hello? Hello, I would like you to take a seat, please. We shall start this third roundtable of the morning on a topic, on a European topic, the topic of European standards. Are they a source of inspiration for the world or not? And before I present to you our four keynote speakers, one of them is following us on video conference, and I think I'm going to give the floor without further ado to Benoît from the Cercle des Économistes to start the debate. Thank you, Béatrice, and hello, everyone. This debate on European standards is quite current at the day where Europe has just voted for a new parliament and will have a new European Commission and will give it a new roadmap for the next 5 years. And why is it so current? Because the European method in terms of standards production is at stake. Europe is being accused to be producing too many standards, and some of them are taking it even a step further because they say that we're receding in technology because we're producing too many norms and standards. So the previous European Parliament was really very active in producing standards. Let's put it this way, just to give you one example, when the Authority of Competition, which I preside, has started the study on generative AI, that was followed by a report that was published last week, which I encourage you to read. I'm doing a little ad here. We started by mapping out all the European legislation applying to generative AI. We have the general regulation on data protection. We have the copyright directive. We have the regulation on numeric data, on data governance, and we also have now a regulation on AI. So that's a lot of fairies that are watching, that are trying to look at the baby, and we don't know if they're good fairies or bad fairies. At the same time, Europe is receding in terms of productivity and in key sectors like AI or green technologies. So the question is, all of that for that. So I'd like to start by saying that European standards are absolutely necessary to ensure the functioning of a unique market. A unique market that Jacques Delors called the cornerstone of European construction. It would be a major mistake to think that we can reestablish European competitivity and sovereignty without basing ourselves on this cornerstone, which is a set of standards that allow this unique market to work and function. And that's what allows us to scale up, which are key in all industries of today, protect our markets. The recent example is the regulation of foreign subsidies that was adopted a few months ago. And it is also a good thing in France to complain about the extraterritorial scope of American law, but the European law is the same because it applies to global companies, and that's the way it is. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be making better laws or less laws at the European level. On a personal note, I think that giving the skills to the member states is not the best idea at the time where we really need to scale up and have scale effect, and where the finance, the member states are quite empty. But a European approach could be maybe more strategic with less priorities, better defined priorities, common European financial tools applied to these strategies, and better proportionate to lift the weight that is the weight that is on a lot of small European companies. And in terms of environmental affairs, I am sure that the misunderstanding of companies, the CSRD of companies, but also of European citizens facing the tsunami of new environmental rules imply that we need to change methods and rules without reducing our ambition. I would like to conclude by a beautiful quote of Václav Havel, When he received the Charlemagne Award in Aix-la-Chapelle, he said the task of Europe is not only about spreading by violence or not its own religion, its own civilization, its own inventions, or its own power. If Europe wants it, they could do something. It could do something else more modest and more beneficial throughout its behavior. It could show that it is possible to treat our planet with consideration and to think about the next generations. I will stop here. Thank you, Benoît. So now we're going to start our roundtable. I would like to introduce our 4 speakers. Thank you very much. Stéphane BOUJNAH, you're General Director of Euronext. Next to you, we have Nicolas NOTEBAERT, you're Director of Vinci Concession and President of Vinci Airports. Neale, RICHMOND, you're Minister of State at the Department of Finance of Ireland, and following us on video conference, Tanja, you're Minister for European Integration of Serbia, and you're specialized of political science. Benoît, you said it, too many norms, too many standards. We've had too many of those in the last years. Are these standards are exportable? And I'd like to start with an example. In air freight, in the air, with a unique sky. Can you tell us more about this standard? How does it get exported? Thank you. We'll have negative examples. I'm going to try to bring a positive note on a topic that you know, which is the unique sky, European sky. How does it work? The traffic rights between countries. You have a national company in one, a national company in another one, not only in Europe, everywhere in the world, and they negotiate traffic rights for their respective companies between country A and country B. It is not very efficient. What Europe managed to produce is any company based in one country, a country A, has the right to operate without limits any lines, any destinations between other countries within Europe. So that allowed for major progress, the democratization of air freight in Europe and air traffic in Europe, which reduced the prices, and you can travel with different airlines throughout Europe. Economic benefits, this is the biggest transfer of richness between the north and the south within Europe. Tourism and going to countries such as Greece and Portugal that were suffering very badly a few years ago, 10 years ago, they're doing better because the share of the tourists in their GDP is increased, and this tool, which is the unique sky, has allowed them to benefit from it. We have 75 airports. We manage the airport of Phnom Penh, in Cambodia. A region that is less impacted by the superpowers of North Asia and Indonesia, Singapore. We want to make sure that they have the same type of devices. Americans and Mexicans, because you know that the American economy is trying to do what the reassuring, to relocate in Mexico some things that were in China. And there's a big work that is being done on traffic rights everywhere between Mexico and the U.S. and the countries such as the Dominican Republic that welcomes a lot of American tourists has just benefited from a very free regime. Latin America is thinking about it. A country like Chile that operates, we operate from Santiago Airport, has benefited for those from those rights. So the reason we have a right to complain about a number of reasons, but it seems to me that Europe has managed to accomplish a few successes, and this unique sky and to free for companies the capacity to move has brought a lot of growth within Europe, a lot of transfer of wealth that are better than transfer of subsidies between countries, and there are many regions in the world that are thinking now, when today closing up is a topic, it's good to have values of openness. I would like to greet the Serbian minister who is following us online. We operate from the airport of Belgrade, and Serbia applies this unique sky rule because they already asked us to open to tourism and to relations with the rest of Europe. So this is something that they did in anticipation for the countries such as Serbia to anticipate being open to the rest of Europe. Thank you very much. Stéphane BOUJNAH, are there other examples of exporting standards? Is it something, do you have an example? Is it an example for the world? Well, on standards, historic standards, for those of you who remember when they were young and fit, you had the GSM, which is an incredible adventure. We'll remember where we had, it's the first cell phone that worked in Europe, and when you arrived at the US, you had to rent, a different phone, and Europe was ahead in terms of cell phone, ahead of the US. It's not the case anymore, of course. If there's an example of export of the European system of value through the standards, I think it's the whole ESG domain. ESG is a fantastic attempt to bring European values, often from Nordic inspiration, to export it to the rest of the world with the money of our asset managers to bring this system of value. We tell the companies from everywhere in the world, if you want us to buy your equity, you need to consume less carbon, you need to be nicer with the environment, and you need to have a better and more transparent governance. These preferences are very European in their style. It's a European vision of capitalism that we're trying to export to the rest of the world. Parts of these goals are common with the US. On some other points, there are clashes. I can give you an example if you want, because I have a lot of experience, and I'd like to bring them up now. If we talk about the diversity part of the ESG, we remember with the US there are clashes. I manage a listed company. I do roadshows. I meet investors. The American investors tell me this is great what you're doing on the environment, and the E on the S of ESG, it's hard to do better, because when you have 58% of the GDP which is socialized, it's you do G a lot. And on diversity, I'm being told it's good what you do on diversity for gender in your governance, but we would like more ethnic diversity. And then you explain to them politely that in Western Europe, it's not easy to make statistics, ethnic statistics, and the color of skin or the racial status. It's difficult to do that. The last time we did that was between 1933 and 1945, and the conclusion is that all the European countries except for the UK, because were faced with the consequences, realized that it's not a good idea to do this profiling. So on certain topics such as diversity with Americans, we have a real difference of views. Some standards, like the ESG standards, they're extremely powerful tools to export our value system with our capital. But on the other hand, that's what was said earlier, there's a lot of doubt. It's not only this bulimia of standards, because the basic example is the link with the market. At the beginning of the 19th century, in all cities of France and Europe, there was a gap of about between 10 minutes and a half hour in the hour of every city. It took the train to really unify the hour. So, because how can you manage a train system if you don't know when they leave and when they arrive? So the unique market requires a form of standardization. The only reason why the rest of the world is respecting us, the Chinese and the Americans, is because we have a unique market. The difficulty and the transition that took place in those last years is a migration towards some standards that are produced without a political steering. And I think that's what DORA is the case of that, is an example of that. Things that were invented by a community of people copy and paste some text of law at the Commission, and they're in the logic of compromise for the sake of compromise, and then they end up in a final decision where they still want to compromise for the sake of compromise, and they come up with a very heavy text, and then they hand it out to people and say, make sure it works, make it work. So it's not that we need standards to have a unique market. It's not about the efficiency. It's the cost itself of standards that has become, at the European level, very too heavy. It's about the making of the standards. Yes, it's just one thing. It's the political steering, because when there's some political leaders who assume the responsibility of the transformation, things can go very fast. If you want to buy 450 million of vaccines in a few weeks for 450,000 people, be vaccinated as soon as possible, that's the policy in the making. If there's political leadership, we can go fast. It's when there's no political leadership that things stay and don't move on. So on the production of standards, and particularly technical standards, is this production too slow, too complex, too politic, or not enough political? I would like to hear the opinion of Neale Richmond. How does this production of standards has helped you in Ireland? What do you have to say on? What is your take on that?
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to speak in English, if that's okay. I think it's very important to look firstly at the history of Ireland, where we were and where we've come from, and how we've been able to utilise European standards to advance. Because yes, they require a massive financial investment, a massive political investment, but there has to be a reward at the end of that investment. And just to give the context, when Ireland joined the EEC in 1973, 55% of our exports went solely to the United Kingdom. We didn't have any large indigenous industry. Our public transport links were absolutely negligent. We didn't have the standards in terms of air quality, water quality, and indeed I'd argue societal quality that would be expected of a modern progressive European country back in the 70s. We move on over 50 years and the advancement has been total. The advancement has been due to not just blindly adopting European standards, but seeing the potential reward of high standards, high regulation can bring not just to an economy, but crucially to society. How we can generate the employment of the future in Ireland by looking at standards. So we look at the economic sectors where we have particular strength. First and foremost, it's life sciences. It's creating those next generation vaccines beyond COVID and lots of diseases, making sure that they're produced to the right European standard in factories that are of a European standard, but crucially, with workers who are trained to a highest possible standard and are open to bringing in workers from across the European Union, companies from across the European Union, but also outside the European Union. So absolutely, getting standards, this has to frame then the thought process for political leaders, not just at a European level, but crucially at a member state level and then a regional and local level, because we can't forget that it's all well and good having the discussion in Brussels, in a room, in isolation, but the politician's responsibility is to go back in their community and say, this is the decision that's being made, this is how we're going to implement it, this is how we're going to support that transition, and the transition can at times be difficult, but the end result will be so much better. And that in turn means that we have to bring the conversation back into the negotiation tables, be it in sort of a trialogue with the Council or the Commission and the Parliament, saying, well, we absolutely want to get there. We want to get to this destination in terms of standards in the next 5 years. You're right, there's a lot of work has been done over the last 5 years in standards, but how can we support the business sector? How can we support our farmers? How can we support our people in order for them to make that transition too? So it's all about having the best level of communication. And the thing that we have to stop constantly referring that this is somehow a weight or a burden. We have to start focusing that this is the opportunity, because we're in a very divided globe at the moment and Europe is facing many threats, not just security, but economic threats, societal threats. And how do we make sure that Europe continues to be competitive on a global stage? We make sure that we have the best talent, the best innovation, and crucially, the highest standards, that those countries that want to do commerce with Europe, that want to engage with Europe, obviously know that they need to do it at a European standard. But also that when we're looking to compete for investment and compete for innovation, we can look to our domestic economies, and it doesn't matter if it's in Ireland or France or a newer member state like Poland or indeed Romania, but they know that those standards will be equal across the entire 27.
I'd now like to hand over to Tanja, if Tanja can hear us. Hello, Tanja.
On a entendu
Yes, we can hear you. And we've been listening to Neale Richmond and the extent to which these standards have helped Ireland to develop. How are you seeing these standards? You are at the door of the European Union.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry that I could not make it to reach and be there with all of you, but nevertheless enjoying the discussion, the previous one and this one. Exactly, I would like to continue where Minister RICHMOND opened the door for the discussion. So actually we are not talking only about 27 as the member states of the European Union, but also others, still outsiders, candidate countries. Is one of the candidate countries that start applying, as Mr. NOTEBAERT said, technical standards as early as the beginning of the 21st century. So after almost 25 years, we are reaching a very good level of standards. Let me compare you or give you some data. At the beginning, Serbia had very small exchange with the EU member states, not only because there were no liberalization of trade, but also because of the pure fact that we could not supply the European market with the goods, which is, of course, with the good standards. Now we are exchanging with the EU market as much as 83% of all that we are producing, which is an enormous breakthrough. And that is in our best interest to apply the standards in order to trade much more with the European Union. But there are also some differences when you are seeing the issue of the Brussels effect or the European standards from the standing point of the candidate country. First, for us, those are not only the standards to apply, but also criteria and conditions for the membership, and that is which is extremely important. But bear in mind that we are not participating and we cannot follow the creation of any standard. Of course, we cannot vote during the process of decision making, but we cannot even, for instance, the artificial intelligence law, we could not follow properly what are the ideas, how the process of the adoption is going on. But yes, it's going to be our obligation and tomorrow assessment of our capacity to become member of the European Union. Second important thing for us, not only technical, but the political standards are extremely important as candidate countries, and particularly, and in the first place, of course, the rule of law. I'm not saying that this is a bad, quite contrary, it's extremely important thing, but it makes the story of the application or harmonization with the European standards even more problematic. And the third thing, the very long process, and I would now refer not only to the legislative process, a long process of preparing or adopting the European standard, but some of them are also have a transitional period for the implementation does not go for us. So we have to start implementing as soon as the member states are implementing, which is the problematic as we are not at the same level. I am referring to the issue of costs of the implementation because, yes, partially they are covered with support through EU budget, through the instrument of pre-accession assistance, but we also are investing a lot. Saying all this is something that for you is important to know and to understand. But also I see the implementation of the European standards in the candidate country, accession country, as the also potential for the for all member states. Let me refer to pandemics. You also referred in terms of the vaccines, but the pandemic showed to all of us that the value chains are extremely the narrow or the close add to the value chain is very much important. And that is one of the issues that we can bring to the European Union single market development. We are very close markets for adding in some of the very important area. Let me mention the Critical Medical Alliance or the critical medical needs, but also critical raw material, and this is a big story in the region. So those are the two aspects from the candidate country that could bring the new vision or new view on the issue of the EU standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So there is a sector where we have the impression that Europe hasn't moved forward, and that is the capital market. I know that, Stéphane, you wanted to talk about this. Why is it essential? Why haven't we been further? Why is it essential today to go further? Stéphane, BOUJNAH. There's a link between your question and the comments that I was making earlier on. So the Capital Market Union, so for savings and investment, it's a project that emerged with a political leadership that was very clear when the United Kingdom was part of the European Union, and this system was set up facilitating a scale-up, and with London being the main financial marketplace. With Brexit, the project continued to exist, but there was no more political leadership. And that's why the project became stuck with the production of fragmented standards that were controversial. Sometimes the attitudes were very amateurish. The reality, well, what's new is that now we've got political leadership. Enrico, in his report, says something that's quite fair. There are three sectors that were deliberately excluded from the single market in the 90s because others didn't want them: energy, telecom, and finance. And so different things happened in these fields, but they weren't as developed as with the rest of the single market. Now, political leaders have gained better awareness, but not just in those for buying finance. And I won't repeat what's been said in other panels with great talent. That we must put an end to this absurd paradox of Europe producing that exports its savings to the United States and imports from the United States capital. So this idea, the make European equity great again, so sending savings to European funds is what needs to be promoted. So projects focusing on the climate or technology or faster rearming of the continent. We need equity for this in order to finance debt. So for these projects, we need things to be speeded up. We need an integration and a reorientation of savings in terms of equity. So some things are a bit blurred in France. In Brussels, there is a specific dynamic that is attempting to speed things up with this equity. So some defragmentation can go quite quickly. You can have an IPO prospectus for the continent. That's quite new. We had a single passport for pets with vaccination certificates, but we didn't have a prospectus for IPOs. So that paradox is going to be solved. So we should be seeing things speed up as long as we solve the questions of ill-placed subsidiarity. So the over-transposition, for example, the awareness that that rules are similar, but in fact they're different. If we want to have identical rules, they have to be identical right from the start. So that awareness that markets are an area where we really need authentic integration and support. These are things that appear to me to be established. So I'm fairly optimistic, but as everywhere, we need political leaders. If we don't have political leaders to get over ambiguities and set up compromises, we'll be coming up with texts that will be full of arthritis and cholesterol. Benoît, would you like to add something to that? No, I just wanted to react to what Stéphane has just said. Stéphane used the word over-transposition. I think that part of the problem is the articulation between the European level and the national level. And this is what I refer to as ill-placed sovereignty. So national politics that think that it's important to make things even more complex at European level. Last year, the French government decided to have national regulations for interoperability in the cloud. That's all well and good. Interoperability in the cloud is important, but it was already covered by European regulations. So there's this new fashion, European regulations are filtering down into national regulations with the attempt to introduce national differentiation upstream of the regulation process. So sovereignty is not there, it's upstream. You have to make sure that the European standard corresponds, matches the interests of France. That's the way to go about things. There's no point making standards too complex. Neale Richmond, if we come back to the necessity to go deeper into capital markets, this is something that you're working on a lot in Ireland. Are things on the right track, as Stéphane has just been describing?
I certainly hope so, and I must add, we have to make sure that European standards suit Ireland too, and European standards have to suit every member state. And this is the difficulty when it comes to the Capital Markets Union. I think there has been a shift change in the last year or two. The Letter report was really clear at identifying what the European Union needs to do to compete on a global scale. And the biggest part of that is access to capital. We have huge ambitions, huge responsibilities that cannot wait in terms of climate action, in terms of improving our infrastructure, in terms of improving our connectivity. But there simply isn't enough public money to do that. So that's where we need to maximise the private capital that is stuck in, and I will use the term stuck in savings across the European Union. And by working on a capital markets union that releases that capital, that allows for that access to finance, we can do a lot more, a lot quicker. So Ireland is very keen to make sure that the capital markets union is achieved, but political concerns come back into it because we have just had European elections. We will have a second election in France tomorrow. And what impact will they have on the decision-making process that had progressed extremely well in the last couple of years at a European level? I would cite European Commissioner Mairead McGuinness took serious responsibility in putting the challenge to member states when it came to capital markets union. You're all agreeing on the generalities of the importance of this, but none of you are actually saying exactly what you want. And we've been quite clear in Ireland that yes, absolutely we want the capital markets union, but we don't want it to be a completely closed capital markets union. We still have to be able to cooperate with our friends in London, with the US, with other markets. And we have to bear that in mind. And we have to make sure that it's a capital markets union that works for every single one of the 27 member states, that all member states can buy into it. I fundamentally do believe that can be achieved. We're on the brink of seeing that being achieved, and the various appointments of commissioners over the coming months into the relevant economic ministries. I think it's so important that the new Commission President looks at the individuals and the member states who have been quite clear what they want from the Capital Markets Union when they're selecting those relevant commissioners, and go forward with that.
So we've heard a lot, and you've given part of the answer, Benoît. We talked about over-transposition, too many standards. Some people are saying it's like a normative hell. What is the reality of the situation? Perhaps it depends on the sectors. Who would like to answer that question? Stéphane, maybe. Once again, I'm sorry to repeat things. The subject is not the standard as such, but it's where it is. And, you know, it's a standard without a leader that's problematic. You know, political determination, when it's based on a 27-strong coordination, there has to be a collective commitment that becomes the standard. The standard itself is the democratic expression based on facts and a political compromise. The difficulty is when there's no political determination. Let me give you an example that's interesting, that explains the ill-ease. It was expressed well this morning in another panel. The two main philosophical, regulatory dimensions of the European construction from a normative point of view for the past 70 years. Well, for one, there's the protection of competition, which guarantees the opening up of Europe. That's the first philosophy. The second idea is the anxiety of stability after the major crisis. There are two main packets of standards that structure Europe today that stem from this opening of the 27. So why do we have a specific policy in the treaty, in the same text? How are we going to cohabit between these different national states? And then there's this competition. So since 2008, there's the idea that the world of finance and risk management has to operate with belts, umbrellas, bulletproof vests, etc. Now, we're in a situation where, if you look at the portfolios of asset managers and we think about the needs of Europe, there aren't too many risks. There isn't enough risk, in fact, compared with 2008. When we talk about energy transition and technology transition and catching up, if we want to build munitions factories, arms factories very quickly so that we can resist the Russian threat, and so that we can engage in long-term projects from an energy point of view, we need equity for this. We've organized a system since 2008 that is drying out this preference for risk. We created a system that atrophies risk. Risk creates systemic problems. Now, the macro problem in 2008 was that there were too many risks. The macro problem in 2024 is that there isn't enough risk to be able to deal with the problems of the European Union in the medium term. So the basic question is the standard. Okay, we've got a standard that counters cycles. That's all well and good for protecting insurance groups. Nothing can happen to them. But the percentage of savings that's sterilized outside of needs is huge. So there's this inertia. There's the vision of the 2000s. There are texts that try and solve problems that no longer exist. And we don't have standards that are adapted to the problems that we have today. So that's basically what the question is that we have to deal with. And once again, it's not something it can only be solved with political leadership. When you have to organize the electricity market as a matter of emergency after February 2022, we can do it. We can go about things as a matter of urgency. For example, COVID, it's complicated, but we managed to do this in July 2022. The question is there a pilot in the plane?
Thank you, Stéphane. There is a sector where we can't really talk about standards, but models that are exported, and it's the sector of concession. And this is a European model that works very well. It has a lot of success. That's what Stéphane was saying. It allows us to deploy some capital, some equity in the world. How does it work? Let's get back to history. For the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, this is the French investors had this idea of a beautiful technical project, and they had to finance it with private money because at the time they were lands, the developing territories, and the counterpart was the right for dozens of years to operate the works. At the same time, in the 19th century, the networks of the train and gas networks were private in Britain or in England. It was the private sector, private investors who did it bit by bit, all the grid and the networks of industrialized country. Why is this model picking up in Europe is because the highway network in France, Italy, and Spain have caught up from the 30s in the US and in Germany. We didn't have the major public works to support that, and that has been helped by a lot of private investors, and now these are world leaders. And these systems export very well because you have two types of countries. You have old countries, aged countries, who have some very strong budget constraints and who dedicate their budget priority to health and aging populations, education and energy transition, and we offer them the opportunity to have some less expensive goods paid for, such as going to the airport and traveling. And this is also for very developing countries who don't have enough capital and the necessary engineering resources to develop new infrastructures. So just a few examples. The first concession is the Phnom Penh Airport in 1995. It was the smallest GDP per capita in the world after the Red Khmer and the peace agreement. Now there are 10 million passengers at the Phnom Penh Airport, and the whole infrastructure was done without any public subsidy from the country, and it allowed it to develop Phnom Penh and then eventually have all the travelers of the world to discover the Angkor temples. The second example is the Japanese. Japan is an aging country. They have a currency problem. This is off the record. We don't like to welcome the Chinese, but we're still going to do it. And they gave us the concession on the Kansai airports so they could go to Kyoto. Kyoto said the same. We can't really welcome the Chinese. Can you help us develop the airport and the relationship with China and Korea? Because we need today visitors from China and Korea. It produces peace as well, like in Europe, because when you start having tourists from neighboring countries, you realize that they're a little bit different, but not that different, and you don't feel like fighting them and going to war with them. My friend Elisabeth Moreno, she's from Cap Vert, and we took over the airports in Cap Vert, which is a very limited in financial resource, but is very happy to welcome visitors, foreign visitors. So all these examples show that the standards in terms of rules of the single market are difficult to export, but that Europeans can produce economic models, entrepreneurial economic models that are useful to produce economy freedom. I'm going to make a confession to you. All the countries in the world who give to an international investor, the concession of infrastructures, port or airport, are countries that want to open up to the world. I'll take another example. During the very short Obama time with the peace process with Iran, we were asked, the Iranians asked us, allocated us the concession to the airports of Isfahan, which is a gem in Iran. There was a reforming president elected yesterday, so I hope we're going to go back to a logic of peace. But the first signal of openness was like to give you all the plans and all the networks of our airport. Can you please tell us how to invest and how to open it? So we also managed the airport of Belfast. There was a civil war in Belfast. Now all the communities are telling us we want to open to the world. We're proud to manage the Belgrade airport. So these concessions, Belgrade and not Belfast. So we open up all those concessions to open up airports, develop the activity, and the more beneficial it is for the private operator, but also for the country. I'll give you a last example. We can also export export our values with us this way. Stéphane mentioned the ESG. During the presidency of Mr. Bolsonaro, we have a lot of airports in Brazil, and our local teams have developed ESG policies that are quite radical, with cultures that are very different than the ones we have in Europe. They became aware of, the rights, developing the rights of the LGBT rights in the airport, gender parity, etc. And this is non-negotiable. Once you're in a concession, if you do it smartly, you can export those values. All our airports are carbon accredited, and it brings to these countries new networks. The recycling of waste in Saint-Gobain was done from the waste of the recycling of waste at the airport. So we can export values. We can our infrastructures. Americans and Chinese are not on it, so that gives us room for us Europeans to take a stand in all these countries and to participate in the development of those countries, exporting capital and creating sustainable links with these countries. You're giving me a perfect transition on the last part of this debate on ESG. Should we take a break with everything that has been implemented in terms of ESG to give time for companies to digest and process that? I would like to hear Stéphane and Neale on that, on ESG. Well, first of all, there's a dynamic that is very ambiguous on ESG because it was dominant in the investment criteria 3 years ago. Now there's some pushback. If you take Q1 2024, there was 11 billion investment in ESG products, more in ESG products, and 9 billion of withdrawal of ESG products in the U.S. In the U.S., there's a break. It's clear. For those who read the publication of Les Pics Corinthiens, it's I guess a French publication, to the market. The last edition this year was a real nuance where they talk about commitment to the energy transition on the E, but they moved back from the S and the G by saying that on those topics, it is up to the clients to make the decision. Because in the U.S., there's a use of the ESG like one of the objects on which there's a war between the wokeism and non-wokeism. It's a bit of a caricature, but our investment pension funds are going to be able to invest in funds with an ESG dimension in Texas and Florida. No. In Massachusetts, yes. The NASDAQ in New York will say if you want to be listed on the NASDAQ, you need to have in your recharging station or in your board one board member that is coming from the LGBT or ethnic minority. The Texas will say if you accept this kind of project, you cannot be listed in Texas. So the ESG topic, in its political view of it, which is not coming from the reality of the functioning of the universe, it's not linked to carbon, but it's linked to the part of collective choices. ESG is raising a real debate in the US, not so much in Europe. This is new. And I think this should encourage us to be very careful because we are touching the limits of it, and it has less impact on companies of significant sizes, what we call quickly the global south, that is saying, well, we want to break away from the S and the G because at Ramco, don't want to be forced to accept diversity of gender diversity and LGBT diversity on the boards. Same with African countries, where this is a bit strange for them to do that. It's the number of people in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya even, who tell you your ESG is neocolonialism. The S and the G are a little bit like when you came with your priests behind the gunmen and the army, and you wanted to impose your religion, the Bible, and now you want to impose to us ESG. That's how they feel about it. So we clearly feel that there's a fragmentation that is going on. On the spending, the savings are, of course, geared towards environmental choices because it's long-term investment, long-term infrastructures and investment, and it's easier to find a consensus if we concentrate on that, on the environmental side of it. Neale, Richmond, would you share the view of Stéphane BOUJNAH on the breaking up of the ESG? We keep the E, but we break away from the S and the G.
His analysis, I don't share his view at all. And this poses a clear challenge to public policy makers within Europe. Things are changing in America. We potentially have a very worrying election result in America. And I would say now is the time for Europe to assume a greater responsibility in championing the ESG agenda. The E is very straightforward. And perhaps, though, we need to change our narrative and our approach to this because it is so important. And it's not ESG isn't important because it's a nice thing to do, or even because it's the right thing to do, because it is what's sustainable for our society and will ultimately lead to greater growth, greater profits and greater development in a way that includes more people in society. And just for any debate, I am a centre-right politician in Ireland. I certainly have never been described as woke in my life. I just think this is really, really important. It's important not just for every single person in this room, but for my children who are 4 and 6 years old and the children they may have in the future. They need to know that not only is there a planet that you can physically live in, but is worth living in. And that's why I think Europe has to stand up. And it's the political class. Stéphane's called for leadership, and I agree with him when it comes to the Capital Markets Union. But now we need even more political leadership. And that comes to communication. We don't hector, we don't lecture, we don't talk down and demand people meet our standards simply because we say they should. But we also have to live those standards ourselves and show quite clearly that there is a clear societal and economic return for those standards. So absolutely, I don't disagree with the analysis. I can see the pushback, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in the Gulf region, and clearly in the United States. But if anything, we shouldn't step back from the challenge and get scared now. Now's the time to keep pushing on, but perhaps be a little bit more unique in our language.
Nicolas, vous vouliez rajouter quelque chose?
Nicolas, NOTEBAERT, do you want to add something? I don't disagree on the risks, but I don't think we should stop. Because, first of all, we only have one planet, and we cannot stop fighting against climate change. So we need to tell people the truth. We have to pick the right narrative. I hear that some say that the wind farms don't work, and you have to vote tomorrow because it works. We need the scientists to tell the truth to people. The planet is dying, the house is on fire, and we need to act. It's not because at some point in some countries, some people are saying lies. When I was a kid, nobody was against vaccines. Today, there's some idiots who tell you that they're against vaccines. It's not because there's more and more idiots on social media that you should refrain from telling the truth. It is very serious what's happening in the planet, and companies must work and relentlessly to fight against climate change. And if we affirm it scientifically, in the US, there's some schools who don't teach Darwin anymore. This is very serious. Darwin is a global scientific heritage. It's not just ideas from the woke. So how do we promote universal values, human rights? We could do it with subtlety. Subtlety means not bringing European standards by saying it's this, you're going to have to adopt this standard in your own country. It's how, through everybody's role, you can bring them. At my humble level, when you have a company or subsidiary in those territories, and it is very appreciated by the people where we operate, we increase the number of managers who are women manager. We're the first one to appoint a woman as president of the airports of Dominican Republic. It was great. It was very well received, and we didn't have to ask for an authorization, and we didn't have to ask everybody to do the same. We just said, this is what we're doing. So I agree that we shouldn't export standards and obligations, but we should not refrain on giving our message and our values. It's important to fight for climate change, for gender parity, For inclusion, we have to also abolish the concept of races or people with different preferences. It's not about adopting them, but it's about clearly saying what we stand for. And European companies are right, wherever they go, to take a stand that is not to ask the countries to change the law, but to say this is our company, and in the way we manage our contracts, our employees, and our environmental commitments in your country, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to give you an example. The last contract we had with Budapest, with Mr. Orbán, we had written in our agreement that the airport of Budapest would be zero net emission in 2030. 20 years before the goal, and nobody reacted to that. So you have to have convictions based on universal values. Equality between men and women is universal, it's non-negotiable, and you do it with calm, subtlety, and we need to take this stand with calm and subtlety. Thank you very much for this very wise conclusion. I thank you all, the three of you. I thank Tanja, who was with us in the video conference, and we're going to move on to the next video.